Hello, welcome to The Drum. I'm Julia Baird. Coming up, with a promise of jobs and cheap power, the government commits $600 million to the creation of a new gas-fired power plant. Changes to the rules for Parliament House public servants. Could it be harder for them to speak out without permission? And what's the beef? Why are more men than women turning their noses up at plant-based foods? So much to discuss. Well, joining me on the panel, Australian of the Year and advocate for survivors of sexual assault. Finally, we have her in the studio, Grace Tame. Great to see you.
Yeah.
Professor of Food Sustainability at Charles Sturt University and former New South Wales Nationals Minister, Niall Blair. Also good to see you in the studio.
Good to be back.
Journalist and broadcaster Pat Abboud. G'day, Pat.
G'day, Julia. Great to be here.
Yeah, good to have you. And in Melbourne, lecturer in the School of Computing and Information Systems at the University of Melbourne, Suelette Dreyfus. Always great to see your face. Thank you.
Happy to be here.
If you want to join in on Twitter, you just have to use the hashtag The Drum, and we are also on Facebook. Now, the government's announced that it will fund the construction of a new gas-fired power plant in the New South Wales Hunter Valley. The plant is intended to help fill a 1,000 megawatt gap in generation capacity when the Liddell coal-fired power plant closes in April 2023. But the Australian energy market operator has disputed this, saying no more than 215 megawatts will be needed. Well, the Prime Minister says the new power plant will force down electricity prices.
Wind doesn't always blow, sun doesn't always shine, and you need firming power from gas to ensure that those renewable energy investments are effective. Battery development is still at a very early stage, and gas is an important transition fuel to support the transition of Australia's energy economy over the next 20, 30 years. So it's an important investment to keep downward pressure on electricity prices. If you don't fill that gap, Australian households, Australian businesses will be paying more for their power.
But finding those savings will require a $600 million investment from taxpayers at a time when the cost of renewables continues to fall.
What is the fastest growing economic sector in the United Kingdom today? It is the renewable energy sector. And everybody said we were a bit crazy going to offshore wind to produce our electricity. We don't have nearly as much sunshine as you guys have. And we've gone for offshore wind. And offshore wind is now producing kilowatt hours cheaper than we can produce with coal and gas.
The government's announcement also comes on the heels of a new report from the International Energy Agency recommending that nations cease investment in fossil fuels now. Niall, why invest in a new gas plant when the market won't go near it?
Well, I think that's exactly why they've had to do it, because if it did make sense, the market would have already moved and industry would have funded it themselves. So that's why I think this is a really confusing decision.
At odds with Liberal Party or coalition philosophy there?
Well, market intervention is at odds with a conservative, capitalist, believing government. So this is why it is quite bizarre. I mean, they said they were going to do it if the private sector didn't invest, and they haven't. And I think that's symptomatic of the lack of direction that the government has set around emissions reduction targets. Industry can't find the certainty to be able to back this in. And I just question whether the investment that we've seen in areas like hydrogen and renewables, the way that that's actually taking off and the rate of innovation, I think that's going to really accelerate over the next few years. So by the time they get the approvals and by the time they build this, I think we'll actually see that industry and the community and the global trading, our global trading partners have moved on.
Suelette, now you wrote a PhD on decision-making and information in large tech-based institutions. One of your case studies was in the energy industry. You've also worked as a consultant to the energy industry in New South Wales. If you were asked about this decision as a consultant, what would you say?
I'd say that it was not a decision based on logic or evidence. I'd say it was a decision based on politics. It looks to me remarkably like a decision by the coalition designed to create a wedge within the ALP prior to the election and presumably have Labor's Joel Fitzgibbon, member of Hunter, saying, well, we need more power plants because that's his seat, and other progressive members of the ALP disagreeing with him who are perhaps green-leaning. And that's what it looks like to me, because you couldn't support this on a logic basis. So we can also judge that by the way that the political announcements have gone. First, the PM says we need a new gas station. It's going to be 1,000 megawatts. But the environmental impact statement was actually for an analysis of a plant of 750 megawatts. But now today's announcement is 660 megawatts. But now we understand that we really only need something in the order of 200 and 220 megawatts. So which is it? It's as though the government is making it up on the fly. The truth is that if you are actually looking for cheap power, you don't need cheap power. What you need is cheap power bills. It's not the same thing. So if you were to replace 18 halogen lights with LEDs in your family home, just average family home, you'd save more than $100 a year on your power bills. And you'd use less electricity, so you don't need to install as many power plants. An LED uses about $5 worth of electricity a year. And what would you do instead with that money? Well, with $600 million, you could, for example, build 2 regional city hospitals. So Wodonga could have a new hospital. The Hunter Valley could have a new hospital. You could build something in the order of 15 new secondary schools or 40 new primary schools. Or you could try and find ways to provide very subsidized education for workers in the Hunter Valley to have jobs of the future, inventing the next LED, building the next advanced LED that's an export-driven value for the economy, rather than actually saying, well, let's just say you have to go, have a period of work when a fair few workers will build the plant, and then a tiny number of workers will actually operate it. So it's not really sustainable jobs of the future.
All right, well, let's hope that everyone's rushing out to get their LED lights after that, Suelette. But for more on this, we're joined by Director of Climate and Energy Program at the Australia Institute, Richie Merzian. Richie, welcome to The Drum. Now,
Thank you.
I just want to walk through this with you step by step, because there is a clear discrepancy between what the government is saying is the case and experts are saying is the case, and I really want our audience to be able to understand why. Now, first of all, the government is saying 1,000 megawatts, there's going to be a shortfall there, and that we need to supply that dispatchable energy. Leaving aside the disputed amount, if that's the case, do we need this supply?
No, we don't need this supply. We have to go by what the experts are saying in the energy market operator, the Energy Security Board, even the government's own Liddell task force, which it charged with investigating whether there would be a gap with Liddell's closure. They've all recommended far lower in terms of any gap that will materialize, and the best part is that we have enough generation coming online, enough firming coming online to fill that gap. So really the experts are not recommending this project, so who is the minister listening to in moving this forward?
What's the answer to that?
Well, I guess one of the suggestions would be that really, if you're building a new gas-fired power station, the only people that benefit are gas companies. You're creating further demand for their product at a time when overnight the IEA is recommending no new fossil fuel projects going forward if we are to comply with the Paris Agreement. So really, we know that the gas lobbyists have been in the ear of the government. They recommended a gas-fired recovery. This is part of that picture. It will help shore up the Narrabri Basin when that is tapped. So ultimately, really, at the end of the day, it looks like the gas companies are going to benefit and we will all pay through higher bills and for this white elephant.
Okay, let's just go back to the questions of the discrepancy again. Now, the government, and they're saying, in terms of who they're listening to, the government will say we're listening to consumers, we're listening to people who are worried about power prices, and this is necessary to force down prices, even though it's actually an expensive thing to do. Can you explain that? Is that right?
Yeah, gas makes electricity more expensive. That's the experience that we've all enjoyed over the last 10 years, and more gas generators aren't the solution here. We know that it's the most expensive way that you can generate electricity, and ultimately these peakers are used hardly ever. We know that Snowy Hydro chose not to use the peaker that it does own yesterday, even though electricity prices were at $1,000 a megawatt hour. So really, gas is not the solution if you want to lower power prices. The opposite is true for renewables, even with storage. So the experience that most of us have enjoyed, including in Canberra, where we've seen electricity prices drop the fastest, is that large-scale renewables are bringing power prices down. The more you get online, the more those power prices will drop. The gap with dispatchable can be met through existing technologies that don't require fossil fuels. It just doesn't stack up on the logic of it, and that's really why so many people are scratching their heads on this project.
So why not gas? The government says it's a transition, it's less carbon intensive than coal. Where does your opposition to it lie?
I mean, gas is a fossil fuel. It's part of the problem. It's not part of the solution. The International Energy Agency confirmed that all fossil fuel projects should be ceased going forward if we are to keep to a safe climate. We don't need gas as a transitional fuel because the technologies are there to fill any gaps that will be created through the retirement of coal. And gas, there is this conception that gas is better than coal. Yes, if you're just looking at the emissions if you burn it directly. But if you look at the entire carbon footprint, which we have to, then gas can be as bad as coal. The methane leakage from gas mining can lead to a footprint that competes with coal in terms of being emissions intensive. And the solutions to moving away from all fossil fuels are already there. So really all we're missing is the political will to take that step now. And if you look at Kurri Kurri, it's right in the centre of the new renewable energy zone the New South Wales government wants to make. There's plans for big batteries in the location as well. We could find a much cheaper solution here that might actually bring electricity prices down rather than just leaning on another fossil fuel.
I'm just going to bring in the rest of the panel here now. Grace, do you see this as a question of political will?
Oh dear. Look, I'm no expert, but this just seems like a big waste of taxpayer dollars. We've heard from the experts here. I mean, it's not necessary. So why are we spending $600 million on something that's not necessary?
I think one of the issues, Suelette, is where this leaves us globally. If we have the International Energy Agency releasing this landmark report, that it's saying there should be no new investments in coal, oil or gas if we're to keep open the narrow possibility of meeting the goals of the climate agreement. So where does this put us?
I don't know, like an energy pariah state. I mean, really, where it's like building this power plant is the equivalent of people who go out and buy more incandescent globes. It's a technology that's 100 years old instead of LEDs. The analogy, we're using it's not exactly a technology that's 100 years old, but it's a bit like that. And the other thing to think about financially, there is the big environmental cost. But even if you don't believe in climate crisis, okay, it's the way that the money is spent on these giant projects. So if you build a power plant, you have to build the whole power plant before it's generating power. So you've got to spend that $600 million on it. If you buy demand management technologies, what you can do is actually do it incrementally. So as that need arises, if your energy demand increases over time, you can invest a little bit more in retrofitting and actually reducing the demand over time. And that means you're not doing one giant whack all at once. That means you don't rely on having to use that. And that plant is not going to be used at 100% of capacity. It would just be too expensive to run.
Niall, can I go back to you as well? When we're talking about discrepancies, one of the most obvious ones is between the position of the federal coalition and the state government. And we have Liberal and national members of the New South Wales state government saying that gas isn't the right way to go, investing heavily in renewables. And I think we have a grab here from Matt Keane.
The cheapest way to now deliver electricity or energy is a combination of wind, solar, pumped hydro and renewable technologies. So it's not fossil fuels, it's now cleaner energy. Those people defending old technologies are the equivalent of defending Blockbuster in the Netflix world.
That's the New South Wales Energy and Environment Minister. And he then goes on to say he thinks it's an ideological thing. How do you explain that?
Well, look, I think Matt's analogy there of Blockbuster and Netflix is a great way of looking at this. And the other thing, I guess, I come from regional New South Wales and I'm heavily involved in the ag sector. There are so many opportunities for our regional communities to embrace renewable energies, to not just reduce our input costs, particularly in things like agriculture, because again, remember, we've got water and wind and sun out there on a lot of our farms, and we've been using renewables for a long time with the windmill and things like that. So I agree with Matt's position, and look, it's not the first time we've seen a difference between the state and the federal government on a particular issue, and I think that this is largely political. I mean, this is a really good wedge. If you want to just strip it right back to the politics, this puts Labor in a really difficult position. Joel Fitzgibbon will be championing this. I don't know what Chris Bowen's going to do on it, and they're going to be attacked from different parts of their own party. So politically, it's probably advantageous, but I think it does put us back as far as embracing the opportunities that we have right throughout our sectors. And again, I work in a sector we're a net exporter when we talk about food and fibre. We don't want to be tripped up in some of our conditions of trade with our partners because of what's happening here domestically. So we've got to act locally, but think globally. And if we were to do that, we certainly would be looking at renewables and other technologies.
Richie Merzian, I really want to thank you for bringing your expertise and insights to the drum tonight. Thank you. Richie Merzian, he is the Director of Climate and Energy Program at the Australia Institute. Now, it's been revealed that the Department of Parliamentary Services has released a new policy restricting staff from speaking to the media without permission from their bosses. It warns that staff found in breach of the policy could face jail time. The Community and Public Sector Union says the Code of Conduct could be used to silence employees.
This is a heavy-handed response from a department that has form on this issue. Workers in Parliament House deserve better, and if we want to know the truth about what happens in this building, we should support these frontline workers.
But the Department of Parliamentary Services say they began working on the rules more than 6 months ago, and it brings their policy in line with other Commonwealth departments. Grace, what do you make of this?
That's what they say. Look, I see the need for caution and discretion, but any kind of forced silence like this is an obfuscation of truth. In a climate where, do you think in Parliament House where more people are suddenly saying, well, there actually is a real problem here, there actually is a toxic culture here, and it's almost a period of storytelling to Kate Jenkins. Yeah.
This
policy is very threatening in nature.
Pat?
Has a very permissive effect on corrupt cultures.
I have a lot to say about this, Julia. I mean, Parliament House, the institution itself, that building is already shrouded in so much secrecy. I mean, those walls are literally impenetrable to the public. In terms of the frontline workers and staffers, if there were mechanisms internally for them to report issues that are affecting them day to day, whether it's a workplace issue, whatever the issue is, if those reporting mechanisms were there internally and there were some processes that were working, they wouldn't need to go to the media. So let's think about that for a moment. What does that say about that toxic culture that exists? And pretty interesting timing that this comes up, just weeks or, not very long after Brittany Higgins' story. So I would ask the question, I suppose, you don't want staffers to go out and, be sharing secrets or leaking information around security. But to me, it's another gag order. It's another way of exercising, disproportionate control and power.
It's weaponising silence. That's what it is.
Weaponising silence. Now, Suelette, but they're saying that they've been working on this for some time. It's just bringing the code, making it more consistent with other government departments.
Yeah. No. So here's the thing. You can have an effective whistleblower policy that allows people to step forward when there's serious wrongdoing and report it to someone who will independently assess it. We don't have a federal ICAC, so not so sure that there is that person or that a whistleblower would have confidence that there would be that person, as opposed to just a dead-end labyrinth that's been created to actually capture people who might speak out. I think the second point is that I've never seen any story about any of the staff at Parliament House, leaking information of a sensitive or security nature to the media or outside. They are very discreet and very professional people. This doesn't sound about right. I think the other thing that's really important is to understand that the public actually really supports whistleblowers. And I know this from my own church. So when asked whether or not whistleblowers should be supported instead of punished, 81% of Australians in a national poll said that they should be supported. When asked whether they should be able to go to a journalist or the media, for example, on the internet, 87% said that they should. And that is consistent with other countries such as the UK and Iceland. So what does that tell you? There is broad-based public support. I don't think that this decision is one that would enjoy broad-based public support.
Well, one thing that has had broad-based public support is your advocacy, Grace. You've had a huge impact. But at times, you know, you have been critical of the government's response. As Australian of the Year, have you felt pressure to not be critical?
Oh, I just call things how they are. That's what I've always done. That's what got me here is being guided by the value of truth. And like I said before, silence, forced silence, is, is not truth.
Yeah. And you were saying it can be weaponised as well.
Yeah,
but can you understand from like how you've spoken out and in what can be sometimes such a hothouse environment, can you understand how it can be hard for people to do so, even when there aren't codes of conduct or threatened jail terms?
I always encourage people to be more afraid of doing nothing in the face of evil and therefore allowing evil to persist than being afraid of doing something.
Niall, as the government, we might say they're worried here about questions of security or government cohesion, but is it also not a question of embarrassment?
Yeah, look, I think it's a really clunky way to address this issue, which I think I agree with a lot of the points. The fact that we've actually had people in desperation having to reach out to the media, I think is a concern in itself. This to me seems to be addressing a symptom rather than a cause, and if the mechanisms are right, that should be the right pathway for people to be able to bring forward their concerns or issues. And from my observation, I haven't seen too many people that have spoken out in the media that have really benefited from this. I mean, I think they've done it, with great personal sacrifice.
Exactly.
They become a target on social media and things like that. So this is desperation. So I think that I don't think everyone does have the strength that Grace has shown to be able to speak out. I think there are some people that definitely think about this, because I mean,
I think she gives people strength.
Absolutely.
I think
that's why I hope she's an enabler in some of those areas. I think some people, unfortunately, would be intimidated, and we need more people like Grace to be able to set that example and show them that they can speak up. A policy like this just sets that back even harder, particularly those people that might be concerned about their job. And the other thing is, we've seen people like Brittany Higgins speaking out against her own side of politics. That's what's remarkable about this. So, this is, there's some real examples that I think have given strength to a whole range of people to be able to stand up and find their voice, and we should be creating a culture that encourages that, not put anything else in there that's going to provide any sort of impediment.
These power structures are already the power structures are already so disproportionate. That's a given. That you're starting from a place of imbalance. So, a policy like this, all that does is tightens the gag that already exists on staff.
It's a reinforcement
Yeah.
of an already negative culture.
All right, to remind you, you are watching The Drum. With me on the panel, Australian of the Year and advocate for survivors of sexual assault, Grace Tame, Professor of Food Sustainability at Charles Sturt University and former New South Wales Nationals Minister, Niall Blair, journalist and broadcaster, Pat Abboud, and in Melbourne, lecturer in the School of Computing and Information Systems at the University of Melbourne, Suelette Dreyfus. Now, when the Treasurer released the budget last week, he unveiled a raft of spending across a range of areas, not least of which for mental health. $2.3 billion has been set aside for counselling clinics and the establishment of a National Suicide Prevention Office. It's an acknowledgement of the stark realities facing many Australians, an acknowledgement that the leading cause of death among 18 to 44-year-olds is suicide, and that in a world of revolutionary interconnectedness, Many have never felt so isolated. For men, this can be exacerbated by a multitude of issues. There's the perceived stigma in seeking help, the barrier that some traditional ideas of masculinity can place in front of them, and those unresolved feelings of loneliness or resentment are pushing some men to extremes. Arno Michaelis is a former white supremacist who was drawn to the cause as an unhappy teenager looking for a place to vent his anger. This is his story.
We must secure the existence of our race and the future of white children.
I was a angry, drunken teenager at 16 years old. I had been a bully my entire life up to that point. Although my family life looked pretty idyllic from a 1,000-foot view, I was really suffering because I grew up in an alcoholic household, and as a kid I could tell my mom was hurting, and it hurt me. My antisocial behavior escalated from being a bully on the school bus to fights in the schoolyard to breaking and entering and vandalism. By the time I was 14, I started drinking myself. By the time I'm 16, I'm a full-blown alcoholic. I'm very familiar with violence, and that's when I was exposed to white nationalist ideology through white power skinhead music. I identified myself as a white man. I felt that white people were persecuted and I needed to fight for the white race or it was going to be exterminated. And when people like a Jewish boss or a lesbian supervisor or Black and Latino coworkers defied my worldview by just interacting with me human to human, it really drove home how wrong I was. Our society has a habit of rejecting anyone that we find distasteful. And again, with social media, it's very easy to be like, unfollow, this person's now shut out of my life, they're off all my social media channels. There's a difference between listening to someone and giving someone a platform to spread their hate. The difference between those two things is compassion. If you do things in a trauma-informed way, which means when you see someone behaving poorly, you don't say what's wrong with them, you say what happened to them. As far as I'm concerned, political extremism of one flavor drives political extremism of the other flavor. It's important that everyone really commits to an active practice of seeing themselves in others and seeing others in themselves, all the more so when it's someone who doesn't look like you or think like you. That's when that practice becomes most important and most powerful.
Pat, you've spent a lot of time researching extremism, especially right-wing extremism and its pull. Do you think that, especially for young men, do you think we talk about it in the wrong way? We often focus on the particular beliefs and belief systems, and we don't talk about, say, identity or depression or even loneliness.
Absolutely. I mean, looking at, I've talked to several young men similar to the men we just heard from, you know, formers, we call them, former far-right extremists, and then other young men on the flip side of that, say, who are at risk of being radicalised by, you know, Islamic extremists. And the common denominator with those experiences is always the word belonging. You know, a lot of the place where they're sort of disenfranchisement starts is there. It's this sense of not belonging to themselves, to a cultural group, to a social group. Basically, they feel sort of left out of society in some way, and that's no excuse for their behaviour or, you know, any of the sort of actions they then go on to do joining any of those groups. But I find it really interesting that no matter what the group is that is trying to recruit or the journey that they go on trying to sort of find themselves in some way, that's what's lacking, that sense of belonging. And that comes from a lot of the language around what identity means and what it means to be a young man now, you know, right now in this contemporary kind of culture that we're in. And the fact that toxic masculinity is something that we're finally talking about in such a public, you know, really loud way. We're talking to the masses and the masses are talking back. And I think that's a really big, huge step towards positive change. But, there are a lot of men who are ashamed to reach out for help, to say, I need help. There are a lot of young men, particularly in rural areas. I mean, it's sad to say, but I think, I've been reporting on the sort of rates of the constantly increasing rates of youth suicide, particularly in rural Australia, over the past decade. And that's been a consistent story that I've covered. So that says a lot about, I suppose, what's already there, what resources are in place and what government initiatives exist. But even before all of that, there's this idea for a lot of young men that it's shameful to put your hand up and say, I need help.
There's also a school of thought, Pat, I'm interested in your views about this. Is that you've said we're having really important discussions around toxic masculinity at last, that are kind of having a significant impact. When we have those conversations, there's often people who might disagree or might feel targeted because of it, or might think, I can't speak my mind anymore. And some people think that pushes people to fringes or to online communities or different places or to extremes. What do you think?
Look, I think there is definitely a growth of these sort of online misogynist groups. In terms of where, the reason that there's a groundswell there is perhaps there are particular groups of men that feel like they are disenfranchised, as I said, from everything. And then they migrate towards those online groups, which are equally as dangerous as a far-right extremist group or as an Islamist group. A group of misogynist men can be equally as dangerous for women, and we all know why. And I think the reasons that they perhaps get there is because, yes, the fact that the conversation's happening in the national discourse, if they feel like they can't articulate where it is that they belong in that discourse, that perhaps does push them towards these sort of, these growing online groups that are emboldening misogyny. And that's a real worry. That's a genuine worry, because those groups do exist, and just as much as the rate of youth suicide in rural areas is going up, the numbers of men sort of being indoctrinated into that school of thought is also growing.
Yep, and I want to return to that actually, because we need to talk about what actually you do about that, especially when it comes to having conversations. But Grace, I've noticed one thing with you, is that when you talk about abuse and when you talk about violence against women, you're always very quick to say, and men too. You can't forget that the men are also victims of violence, have also been abused.
They're also part of the solution too.
Right. Do you think that they're often excluded from that?
Yeah. I mean, obviously there is an imbalance. Women are disproportionately affected worse so than men. But, some of my closest friends are male survivors of clergy abuse.
Right.
I think what the problem really stems from here is that there's so much of a focus on, when you're defining yourself, it's so much of a focus on negative identity. It's what am I not, and who do I hate, as opposed to who am I, and who do I relate to? And at the end of the day, we're all human beings, and that's often forgotten, is that we have that core humanity that binds us all.
That's right. So, Suelette, do you think that there is, the basic premise is that if there's a section of society that feels marginalised, how do we fix it? You have also watched a lot of this play out online. How can you address this problem in those communities?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest overall thing you can do is jobs in a booming economy, because, what you've got right now is a whole bunch of workers that have been sent home for COVID who are inching back here and there around the world, but a lot of them will not go back to jobs. And many of those workers will be men over 55 or even over 50. So there is an opportunity there for them to feel not only isolated, but also kind of worthless. And, the algorithms that exist when you apply to online job sites may or may not be accidentally or otherwise weeding them out. We don't want someone over 50. We don't want a white male over 55. And so that becomes even more discouraging. They're applying for 30 or 40 jobs, not even getting an interview. What does that all mean? If we don't actually find a way to re-engage these people, and that's true, by the way, of disaffected youth as well, if we don't find a way to re-skill them and offer that re-skilling at a low or very free price, then you're going to have these segments of society that will talk to their own, amplify those feelings of anger and hatred through online media, because places like Facebook feed you more and more through their algorithms what you want to hear. And then you'll have this fragmentation with angry communities, and angry communities, a portion of which may become violent. So that is not a recipe for a happy society. And you know, if you don't have a job and you want a job, you feel badly. You feel like a failure, even if it's not your fault. In the 1991 recession, we had something like 11% unemployment, and it didn't return to its previous state for like a decade. So all those people were out of job for that time. It's very, you feel despondent. So we have to address that as kind of the underpinning. And from that, you have to build community programs that actually reach out to these communities and build positive communities for them. And you can do it inexpensively with technology.
It's also, I think it's important to note there too, I agree with everything Suelette said there, but the thing for a lot of younger men is this idea of finding your tribe, and Grace touched on this before as well. It's probably a lot easier for young men to be fooled into thinking or feeling like they've found their tribe online, because you don't see the people, you don't know what their real identity is or where they're from or anything about their, you know, their sort of real history. So if you're fooled into feeling like you finally belong somewhere, all of a sudden you're indoctrinated into a school of thought that you may have never come across before. You have this sense of finding your tribe. So yeah, these online communities are genuinely a worry that we should be talking about.
And some of the, Niall, can I bring you in here? Because there's some of the more mainstream online communities, like with social media, where a lot of conservatives will report a growing intolerance for, we've talked about polarisation before, but a growing intolerance for their views. We notice sometimes if people come on the drum and say things like, I don't know, Morrison did a good thing here, or express like a pro-coalition viewpoint. In some forums, probably more likely to be Twitter, they will be absolutely savaged for it. Do you think there are consequences for that in terms of the fact that people go, well, I won't be on Twitter anymore, I'm going to go off somewhere else?
Oh, look, you know, we just never know what is that one last straw that breaks the camel's back.
Have you seen any evidence of that, though?
Well, not towards me, in you know, in that sense, but certainly, well, I mean, I could say when I was a member of Parliament, absolutely. I mean, no one knows what's going on in your own life. We're all human at the end of the day, but you know, that sort of thing, we just don't know what's going to be the tipping point for some people. And I guess, again, if I share my own experience, I came from, you know, an adversarial industry that for nearly 10 years, you couldn't show any weakness. And now I'm in my, you know, I'm still just in that age bracket that has that highest rate of suicide. And I'm now starting to learn about vulnerability and how that works in with you know, leadership and in business and things like that.
Right.
That to me, I shouldn't be finding out about vulnerability and how to accept that in my mid-40s. I should be, you know, that's the sort of thing that should be happening so much earlier. Yeah. And to me, if I had shown a bit of vulnerability when things were tough in the political arena, you know, that would have been capitalised on by maybe people who wanted my job from my side or even the other side. So I think you just don't know what's also going on in someone's life. So those, you might think it's one comment, but it could be that straw that breaks the camel back.
And it's not, obviously, it's not just people on the right, though we are talking about people on the right. It's people on all sides of politics who often feel that they get hammered or for expressing certain views.
Yeah, it's a false idea that being strong and admitting weakness are mutually exclusive ideas.
Right.
Just because you admit weakness doesn't mean you're not strong.
Yeah, it can be a very strong thing.
In fact, it can be very empowering to do that.
Exactly. Look, for more on this, we're joined in London by economist and author of The Lonely Century, Nerina Hertz. Nerina, welcome back to The Drum.
Thank you, Julia, for having me back on. What an interesting conversation that really speaks to a lot of my insight and research.
Yes, exactly. And I'm obviously, I really want to talk to you about how, you know, I thought the insights in your book about how loneliness can lead to extremism were really fascinating. But before we get into that, can you talk us through the mouse study that you refer to?
Yes. So there was research done with mice, and researchers observed that when they put a mouse in a cage, the longer the mouse was left alone in its cage, the more violent and aggressive it was to a new mouse when the mouse was introduced into the cage. And which, is animals showing that isolation breeds a sense of aggression and hostility towards others. And we've seen this play out with a number of studies on humans as well, whereby what we see is that when people feel lonely, and of course this isn't everyone who's lonely, we're talking about on average, but when people feel lonely, they're more likely to perceive the world as a hostile place, as a more threatening place. It's like, have you ever taken a walk in the woods and seen a stick on the ground and thought it could be a snake? Well, that's, for lonely people, how the world seems. It seems a world full of snakes, not sticks. And there was actually research done on siblings in the UK, and they found that siblings who lived in the same neighbourhood, the lonelier sibling perceived the neighbourhood as more threatening and hostile. And what happens, of course, and this speaks to what Pat was talking about in Suelette, what happens is that you have a constituency who already are feeling lonely, disproportionately lonely and isolated, particularly white working class men, but not exclusively, of course. So you already have this group, and then you have communities emerging who are fueling this anti-other rhetoric and also weaponizing community, delivering belonging, but of course a very excluding and exclusive kind.
Yes, and you say in your book that you think right-wing populists are very good at providing solutions to people who are lonely. Why is that?
Well, whether they are real solutions or not is debatable, but the illusion of solutions. Firstly, because right-wing populists, more than any politicians in recent times, have understood the need for a rhetoric of community. So if you think about whether we were talking about Trump's rhetoric or Le Pen's rhetoric in France or other right-wing populists across the globe, they use the rhetoric of community. They talk about we. They talk about you, the forgotten people. I am hearing you. So they speak very clearly to that. But also they've proven very skilled at delivering what we might think of as a theatre of community, rallies, events, get-togethers, online as well as offline, whereby they're really kind of delivering this semblance of community. So it's partly speaking to that sense of marginalisation that we know a lot of people legitimately have. It's partly about delivering theatres of community. And it's partly about speaking to that sense of anti-otherness, anti-other and fear of other that we know that lonely people disproportionately have. And it's that combination that plays out effectively, whether we're talking about right-wing populist politicians or QAnon or incel movements or etc.
Yes. Now, Pat, I can see you nodding your head firmly there, because this is what you found as well, right? If we talk about solutions to this, fostering community is a strong one.
Yeah, and that's the thing. As I said before, you've got to think about when you fall out of, if it's a cultural group that you're part of and you fall out of that, you're left on your own. If it's, socioeconomic issues, you fall out and you're left on your own. If you're, a follower of a particular faith system and you fall out of that, you're on your own. So again, the common denominator there is, as I said before, it's who do you now belong to? And these people, a lot of these people don't have the ability to work out this idea around identity that first and foremost you belong to yourself. And when you understand that about your identity, then you work out who you are and who your tribe is, and what you're going to achieve and do in the world, or how you're going to move through the world. So I really find it fascinating that no matter what the sort of extreme is, far right or left or in the middle or any of those sort of examples I gave before, there's always that common denominator of I don't understand who I am, how I'm supposed to feel, what I'm supposed to think, where I belong in the world and what my place is.
But Grace?
Yeah, I think part of the problem is, though, that you know, one person's belonging or one community's sense of belonging doesn't have to come at the expense of another. You know, we've heard that, the other panellists speak to that, about it, you know, it being not about division, because it's evil that thrives on division.
Not a community based on opposition, but so on what you have in common.
Yeah, it's one thing to have a community, but if that success of the community or happiness of the community comes at the expense of another, there's the problem there.
And I think the solutions there are to say it's okay to feel like you don't belong, but, you know, don't run from yourself in order to find something else that perhaps, you know, is going to be detrimental to that identity that you're trying to find within yourself.
Yes, and Nerina, I know you just want to hop in, but just before you do, I just want to remind people who haven't read your book who might not know this, that in The Origins of Totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt writes about loneliness as being the foundation of a totalitarianism. And I did not know this because you said its adherents' chief characteristic is not brutality or backwardness, but isolation and lack of normal social relationships. She says for those people who feel they have no place in society, and it's through surrendering their individual selves to ideology that the lonely rediscover their purpose and self-respect. I was completely fascinated by the research that you dug up there from her and what that tells us about some of those dangers. Given that we've seen this in history before, like what are your reflections on moving forward?
Yes, and of course Hannah Arendt was talking about the very extreme case of the origins for the rise of Nazi Germany.
Yes.
But I think moving forward, the first thing is it's essential to recognise that loneliness has, economic and technological drivers, that loneliness is political as well as personal, which means, and its drivers are structural, which means that there are really important steps that governments can and need to take here. First of all, they need to commit to refunding the infrastructure of community. We've seen really ever since the 2008 financial crisis across the world, a steady defunding of youth clubs, of public libraries, of community centres, of public parks. People need physical spaces to be together so that we can come together as a society. So that's really important. The other thing, we've talked about the role that social media plays here in fueling and amplifying division. Governments really need to view social media companies as the tobacco companies of the 21st century and regulate them as such. And here in the UK, we actually have a bill that's currently going through Parliament, which is going to really demand much more of social media companies than has been demanded in the past, and is something to look at. And the third thing is, we're living at a time where this pandemic has really accelerated rates of loneliness amongst our societies, which already were high. Already in Australia, before the pandemic, 1 in 10 Australians said that they felt lonely. In research done last year, 1 in 5 Australians said that they felt lonely. And if we look at research from across the world around now, as much as half the population feel that they are lonely. So really addressing loneliness is a matter of urgency, but so too is ensuring that schemes are in place to bring different kinds of people together. And again, there are lessons from across the world that we can all draw upon that are having positive effects.
Nerina Hertz, I was sorry to wrap it up there, Pat, but Nerina Hertz, it's always a great pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for giving us your time again. Nerina Hertz is an economist and author of The Lonely Century. Now to another not unrelated topic. What could be more masculine than a carnivorous diet? Now, it might sound strange, but according to a new survey from not-for-profit group No Meat May, what we choose to eat has become a gendered issue, especially when it comes to meat. The Drum's Bethan Smolenick explains.
Steak. That's what a man eats.
Made from stuff guys need. You'll look like more of a man with a quarter-pounder in your hand.
This notion of meat and masculinity has been around forever. Both men and women associate the more meat you eat, the more masculine you are perceived to be.
That is just one of the many findings from No Meat May's 2021 survey of 1,000 people. It found 30% of men said they would never give up meat or animal products, compared to just 19% of women.
Over the decades, women have been socialized to care about what they're eating, mostly from the point of view of what I eat is going to affect what I look like.
I just want to eat what I want to eat.
The opposite of that is that men have been socialized not to care about those things.
Men feel threatened by this concept of plant-based food or people taking their meat away.
Real men eat meat, and going vegan makes you a weak soy boy.
More than 70% of men opted to live a shorter life rather than giving up meat.
1/3 of men also believed humans are meant to eat meat.
There's a link between meat and protein, where people actually think, well, meat's the only place you can get protein from, which is completely crap.
Focusing on protein and working out at the gym and body dysmorphia and wanting to look a certain way harks back to those really traditional toxic masculinity stereotypes of I need to be strong, I need to be unemotional.
Mom! The meatloaf!
Ryan Alexander believes many men have been taught these habits from birth.
It's a barbecue, an Aussie barbecue.
I had 6 older female cousins who, they stayed in the kitchen, and I went out as the 7-year-old with the tongs with Grandpa, to cook the meat.
You can't be cooking meat over a flame.
But it's a meathead culture where we're taught that, from a very young age, this is what being a man is about. Avoiding meat and dairy is the single most effective thing that we can do as individuals to reduce our environmental impact.
Yet, despite 81% of men saying they care about the environment, 79% of them said they wouldn't stop eating meat even if it would help the planet.
It's about this idea of perhaps not caring about things like animal rights and how my consumption of meat might be affecting climate change.
Outdated stereotypes about masculinity, Ryan wants to change.
What's more masculine than protecting the planet, saving lives, living healthy so you can be here for the people you love?
Niall, do you associate being a man with meat consumption?
No, I just enjoy it. I hadn't really thought that much about it, but we know that it's actually a trend that we're seeing across all genders, that people are moving away from meat being the star of a dish and more as the condiment on the side. So we know that is a trend with consumption. There's still a lot of debate out there around the sustainability and the footprint of, let's say, a straight plant-based diet versus a balanced diet that might include a lot of meat. I mean, we could probably do a whole show just on this topic, but no, for me, I haven't seen eating meat as a gender-based thing. I probably have cut back myself in how much meat I consume, and I'm probably have a more of a diverse diet now than I probably did 20 years ago, but hadn't really linked the two. I think that we are seeing a lot of people now looking to maybe take meat out of the meals one night a week, for example, a meat-free Tuesday or meat-free Monday. And as someone that's associated with the mushroom industry, bring that on as well. Because
are you on the board of a mushroom company?
Declare that, but I am on the board of a mushroom.
So you need to make
company.
Mushrooms very masculine, do you think?
Well, I mean, it's. I think we've all got challenges to look at how we then meet the dietary requirements of a changing society and around those attitudes. And there will be, I think, a place for everyone in the future. Some people will want lab meat. Some people will want plant-based protein. Some people will want straight meat. Some people may want meat, but they want to know how it's been produced and the backstory and the sustainability footprint that sits behind it. And some people won't care. So I think there's room for everyone.
Suelette, what of this finding that men are more attached to meat, more reluctant to give it up than women are? Why do you think that is?
Look, some of it is the stereotypes. And I mean, you get online and just do a search, and if you're searching for things to do, you're probably your profile's known by Google when you Google search, and you're searching for something to do with your gym and protein. Meat and lots of, protein additions to your build-up diet are probably going to be there. But the truth is, as the conversation has said, you don't have to be eating a roast every night to get plenty of protein. I mean, I myself, I've become what's sometimes termed a flexitarian, kind of the new term, coined to describe, not by me, coined to describe someone who eats mostly plant-based food, but sometimes has, meat or poultry or fish. I like the idea that it does have a benefit for the environment, but I really like the idea that it's super healthy, right? So you're going to live longer. You're not going to die as early. And the health data is pretty overwhelming. You are going to have an increased risk of disease from heart disease, stroke, diabetes, if you eat processed meats. Even people who eat just red meat, are going to face that. So you go for nuts. I love mushrooms. That's great. You said mushrooms.
Oh, everyone loves mushrooms on this panel.
I love mushrooms.
With mushroom in the middle, yum.
Can concur. I love mushrooms.
Now, Pat, you say you love mushrooms. What we just heard was that men who become vegans are worried that they might be called a weak soy boy.
I'm proud of. I can say I'm proud of being a weak soy boy. Soy milk all the way.
Yes.
Look, I've never really put meat and masculinity together. The first time I sort of thought about my meat consumption was when I did a story, sort of middle of last year, on the amount of land clearing that goes on in Australia in order to farm cattle to meet our demand. That really opened my eyes. And even if I wanted to give up meat, I must say that I'm Palestinian, Lebanese, Australian. My mother would never hear of it. There's a lot of meat in our diet. So for me, my relationship with meat is actually cultural. When we have family feasts, which is pretty much every other weekend, there's 20 or 30 people at a table, and I would say, 90% of the dishes are meat-centric.
Maybe you need to be like a feastatarian, or a mamatarian. I eat meat around my mother and then less the rest of the time.
It's funny because when I was a kid, I really loved vegetables and I actually wouldn't eat a lot of meat. My mum told me this in my sort of early 20s, and she used to sort of hide meat in very rich sauces with lots of vegetables in order to make me eat meat.
And that's made you the man you are today, obviously, Patrick Grace.
Meat and masculinity. I've never questioned my gender before. I love meat, but I think part of the problem is that we've become very divorced from this idea of a balanced diet. I don't know. I think that the people who follow a balanced diet are in the minority these days, and part of the problem too is with, the media's focus or certainly fast food's focus on meat in everything, the double patty with the bacon as well and the egg, and it's just it's too much.
Too much. Got to pare it back. Now, if you've been affected by anything we've been discussing in the show tonight, I just want to say please do call Lifeline on 13 11 14 or Beyond Blue on 1300 22 46 36. That is all we have time for. We've got through so much tonight, thanks to our panel. Hope you have an excellent evening. I'm going to see you again on Friday. I think you've got Ellen tomorrow. Good night.